And now on to the course today. It's titled A Civil Dialogue on Abortion. The abortion issue is a particularly difficult and sensitive one. People care about it deeply and for different reasons, though at times for surprisingly symmetrical ones. Philosophers Dr. Jack Mulder and Dr. Bertha Manninen, who are on opposite sides of the debate and wrote a book about it, will offer the reasons for their respective views and suggest that there is a space for common convictions outside the abortion debate. Today, they will basically be discussing the personhood aspect of abortion, and then next Monday, they'll consider the issues of autonomy as it relates to both the pregnant woman and the fetus. Jack Mulder is professor of philosophy and current chair of the Department of Philosophy at Hope College. He has written numerous books, articles, and chapters on Soren Kierkegaard, Catholic theology, the philosophy of religion, sexual and reproductive ethics, and the philosophy of race. Dr. Mulder earned a BA from Hope and an MA and PhD both in philosophy from Purdue University. Dr. Manninen is professor of philosophy at Arizona State University. She has written extensively on the ethics of abortion, the philosophy of religion, biomedical ethics, and normative and metaethics. Manninen has a Bachelor of Arts from Florida International University, an MA in philosophy from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and a PhD in philosophy from Purdue University. So I will turn it over to Dr. Manninen and Dr. Mulder.
All right.
So I'll let Jack get started.
Thanks, Mark. Bertha, do you, so Bertha and I are old friends, so we might be kind of a little less formal from time to time. So we'll try to do this the best way we can. Yeah, so thanks for joining us, Bertha. Appreciate you being able to, use the magic of the internet to join us today.
Yeah, thank you for zooming me in.
Thanks to everybody here. So, and thanks for joining us. So again, like Mark said, the thought we were working with was that maybe today we would spend some time on the personhood issue. Like what counts as a person? Is the fetus a person? That kind of thing. And so we'll get started with that soon. Before we do that, though, I thought maybe we would kind of open the dialogue with a little bit about kind of how we got started with this project. Mark mentioned, I think, that our work sort of eventually became a book that and so that was a project that took some work. Why did we engage in that work, right? And was it good? Was it worth it and all of that? So I think maybe, Bertha, if it's okay, I'll pitch. I'm going to kind of lightly moderate this just because we figured this would work. Bertha, can I just pitch that first question to you? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Right. So the first question we were just going to do here says, okay, Bertha, since you've co-authored a book on abortion with a man, well, that's me, you must believe that the effort was not wasted. Right? That is, you must think that men can, in some cases, enter into the discussion surrounding abortion. How would you respond to someone who argued that men should not have a say at all where it concerns abortion? And that you can take that as kind of an opportunity to talk a little bit about the genesis of the project, or the kinds of dialogue we want to engage in, or whatever that prompt raises for you.
Sure. So I think there's a couple of layers that I want to answer that question. In terms of the fact of abortion being a philosophical issue, a rights issue, things like personhood, which we've talked about. Of course, I think a man has opinions about that or arguments about that. I don't think being one specific gender precludes you from having philosophical or ethical beliefs. So I'm happy to engage in that dialogue with a man, just because I think a man has ideas about these issues and they should be heard as well. At the same time, I think the people who typically ask or say those things are coming from a place of feeling that people who will never be directly affected by something have little say in how it's going to affect other people, right? Um, like I'm trying to think of a male only issue that you could say that a woman probably doesn't. It's not that she shouldn't have anything to say; is that she can't understand that perspective, and that she can't have that first person experience with it that adds a layer of knowledge and complication to the issue, right? Another concern that people have is that there's a lot of people, a lot of men, particularly in politics, that are making laws, abortion laws, that have very little idea what the biology that they're talking about, right? So the two that come to mind was, a few years ago, I had it here, but now all of a sudden my mouse is not working, so I can't scroll to my notes. Sorry. I think it was Aiken was his last name. I don't remember. I think his first name was Tom or Todd. I forgot his name, but he was a congressperson, and he made a comment that pregnancy from rape is very rare because the body has a way of shutting that down. That's not true and absurd. The more recent one is that there was a bill trying to be passed in Ohio that would require doctors to try to implant an embryo from an ectopic pregnancy. And that if a doctor didn't attempt to do that, he could be or she could be prosecuted. I have no idea how that even could possibly come about in someone's mind, because that is biologically impossible. You cannot take an ectopic pregnancy and put it in the womb. It's not possible to do, right? And so I think when people say, well, men shouldn't have opinions about these things, I think they're talking less about can they have philosophical beliefs or ethical beliefs or metaphysical beliefs about abortion, and more about they don't have the requisite knowledge necessary to be making laws about this stuff. And in that sense, I'm sympathetic, but in a philosophical sense and a theoretical conversation in terms of ethical principles, of course, I think a man has a right to those things, as Jack does.
Okay, thanks. So one of the questions that we thought that that I could try to respond to a little bit has to do with this, and this is actually something that I get a lot because I'm coming at this issue from what we call a pro-life perspective. We can also talk a little bit about kind of the terminology we use if we want to do that too, but the question that we had there was, imagine somebody putting, imagine somebody putting that question to Bertha about, how can you engage in this, discussion with a man? Imagine somebody putting this question to me, right, which might go something like this. In order to be pro-life about abortion, right, it seems one needs to think that abortion is killing in some way, since there doesn't seem to be another reason to oppose it. Okay. But if one thinks that abortion is as serious as that, right, how can this be a matter for civil dialogue, right? How do you respond to a fellow, if you will, pro-lifer who thinks that there's no room for dialogue on abortion since the issue is just too dire, right? It's so heavy, so significant, so serious, right? So that was one of the questions that we thought maybe I could try to respond to a little bit. And for what it's worth, I get that question a lot, right? Some form of it or other, right? But by way of response, I'll just start by saying this. I think it's important to kind of distinguish, right? Between a few different things. So I think that when people talk about killing, right? I think a better term in this case could be something like homicide, right? Which is just a forensic term, right? Someone can, a coroner can say that something has happened that's homicide, and then you undertake an investigation to figure out what are the factors, what are the premeditations, what are the sort of motives, and this kind of thing, right? And for example, penal codes, right? usually define murder as like an unlawful act of killing that includes what's technically called malice aforethought. Okay, that is, you have to be sort of thinking about the act with malice, right, in mind, right? And it's for that reason that I think it's usually the wrong way to go to use a term like murder when you're thinking about abortion, right? I think it's highly implausible in most cases, right, that people who are undertaking abortion, right, are engaged in malice aforethought, right? I think in just about every case I can think of, right? I mean, I suppose it's logically possible that someone's engaging in this in a really wanton way, right? I don't think it's very likely. I think that it's most of the time what we're talking about when we talk about abortion is people who are forced into especially difficult circumstances, right, by this or that, right, social or political reality, or just there's the things have taken a bad turn, and there's a lot of again, I think all I'm trying to say is that I think that most people who are in that position, right, to take abortion seriously, probably wouldn't have chosen to be in that position, right? Most of the time, it's a very, again, really just not a case where I see malice entering in most of the time, right? People usually see this as kind of a last desperate option. And so, that's one thing that I want to say just by way of framing the discussion. Another thing I think here is just I want to say a word about friendship, right? Because to think that I think a lot of times we're engaged in a society like ours in issues where we need to allow ourselves to make friends with people from across the proverbial aisle on a lot of things, right? And that's really important, right? It's not how friendship works when we have a really dire issue and we just decide to sort of hole up in our echo chambers and not engage with one another, right? And that can kind of bring out a kind of ideological hardening. It can bring about kind of this, one side gets further and further away from the other, right? And it can also bring out a lot of resentment, right? And I just don't think those are really helpful. Another thing to think about here is, for example, in our current political climate, right? I think dialogue is really important, right? If you think about somebody like Plato, I'm a philosopher, and so Plato's, kind of one of our guys, right? In Plato's Republic, there's a line about infanticide, right? Which is actually perfectly common in ancient Greece, right? And it's, and Plato's just like, oh yeah, well, of course we do that, right? If if there were some kind of case where we the pregnancy we were talking about, kind of ended in whatever way they regarded as badly, right? And they would say, oh yeah, well, just infanticide, that's how it goes. I mean, infanticide by exposure was just very common in ancient Greece. But nobody proposes that we just burn Plato's works, right? I mean, nobody thinks that we shouldn't read Plato, or at least if they do, they're not very well heard in our current society. Most people think of Plato as kind of a foundation for a liberal arts education, or, kind of a building block for responsible civil engagement, and so, yeah, I think that, we can approach people like that with circumspection. We can be careful. We can be thoughtful. We can keep those kinds of hesitations in mind. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be willing to engage, right? It's also, and because of that, this is an issue about which intelligent people have disagreed for a long time, okay? So, for example, right, I'm Catholic, and St. John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, himself was a pro-life thinker, if ever there was one. And sometimes, he had this line about, kind of making your views clear, but also be reasonable about what you can do in the political sphere, right? So he says this, and this is a kind of longer quote. He says, in a case like the one just mentioned, when it's not possible to overturn or completely abrogate a pro-abortion law, now this was his term. Bertha and I don't use the term pro-abortion in this book. We can talk about that in a minute if you want to, but yeah, I mean, so again, this is back to John Paul II. When it's not possible to overturn or completely abrogate a pro-abortion law, an elected official whose absolute personal opposition to procured abortion was well known, right? This person's clear about, right, the way, he or she feels about abortion. That elected official whose personal opposition to procured abortion was well known could licitly, that is lawfully, support proposals aimed at limiting the harm done by such a law and at lessening its negative consequences at the level of general opinion and public morality. This does not, in fact, represent an illicit cooperation with an unjust law, but rather a legitimate and proper attempt to limit its evil aspects. That is, so again, we've got a kind of representative democratic republic here, right? And to preserve a republic like that, to preserve, a kind of democratic republic, you need to listen to one another, right? And sometimes you need to, although, the word compromise is kind of funny here, right? Because sometimes we talk about someone compromising her ideals or something like that, right? And that's a bad use. But then we talk about little kids and their petty squabbles, and we talk, well, let's get to a compromise, right? And compromise has a bad sense and it has a good sense, right? But even Pope John Paul II here is saying, look, there are times where, you can't get everything you want in a democratic republic. You've got to listen to one another. And sometimes you can sort of move things forward, even though the bill you sponsor doesn't do everything you'd love for it to do at that particular moment, right? You can talk about, parental consent measures. You can talk about, what kind of timeline is appropriate when you're thinking about abortion. You can talk about those kinds of questions, even if, right, the one person's sort of resolutely opposed and the other person isn't, right? There's still sort of ways that you can work together, right? And I think that's important. So anyway, I'm sorry if that was a long answer, Bertha, but anything else?
Yeah, I want to add a couple things. First of all, it's not just people who are pro-life that asked that question. So I was involved in an abortion panel a couple years ago at the community college, and one of the speakers they invited, who was pro-choice, said that she absolutely will not be on a panel to debate abortion because it's not even something that to debate it would be to insult women or something like that. So she wouldn't even hear about debating it. So that type of question, that type of attitude you could see a lot on the pro-choice side as well. So to be fair. Second thing I wanted to say is something that you said earlier, Jack, that I thought was relevant. This is why when people will say things like, well, if you don't like abortions, then don't get one. And that's a bad argument because it doesn't understand the foundations that people are coming from, right? If you sincerely think that abortion is murder, then you can't just say, well, if you don't like murdering, then don't murder, but I'm going to murder, right? So that's a bad argument. I always cringe when pro-choice people make bad arguments. So that already doesn't understand where a pro-life person was coming from. And third, one thing that I wanted to highlight is that this is actually one of the main reasons, and we can get into this as well, why I chose to do a project like this with Jack, is because he's empathetic, right? So most people I shouldn't say that. A lot of people that are pro-life will say things like, oh, well, the woman's just being selfish, or the woman was just being irresponsible, or the woman it's just out of convenience, and they assume the absolute worst in her, like she's some sort of monster that was plotting to get an abortion this whole time or something. They assume the absolute worst of her character, and Jack was like, no, we shouldn't do that. Most people that are faced with this option are in a desperate situation. And so the fact that he's willing to give that benefit of the doubt, the fact that he's willing to extend that empathy, and not assume the worst is one of the main reasons that I was very happy to write this with him.
Thanks. And I feel similarly, Bertha always kind of feel like comes a long way toward, kind of be in a position where she can understand why people, right, take this issue really seriously, right? And, is willing to kind of say, well, just because I have this view, let's not be cavalier and let's take it very seriously and see what everybody thinks here. But and also, I mean, I don't know, Bertha, might it be worth just a moment of our time to say something about kind of where we use the terminology like pro-choice and pro-life and stuff like that? Is there anything you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, like I don't use the term, well, that'd be like in some of my literature, because Jack knows that sometimes you just have to make the peer reviewers happy.
Right.
In some of my literature, I have used the term anti-choice just because more often than not, the peer editors want me to. But it isn't also a term I like to use because again, it's assuming, right? I've never met, I mean, I'm sure again, humanity doesn't surprise me anymore. So I'm sure there is someone out there, but I haven't met any pro-life individual who believes that women don't have a right to their body. I haven't met a pro-life individual that think women should be enslaved for gestation or anything like that. So most people that are pro-life are so because they genuinely and sincerely think that a fetus is equivalent to a baby. And so I wouldn't use the term anti-choice to describe someone like that. And similarly, I hate the word pro-abortion because it implies that um, that abortion is something we celebrate or abortion is something that we push, or which is also not true. Like for me personally, I'm fine with, if you want to raise the baby, fine. Not only do I think that's fine, I think society should help you do that, which is something that we do have in common. If you want to give up for adoption, I think that's fine. And I think society should help you do that. And I think part of that also is, helping fix the foster care system. And so I don't push abortion. I don't say, yeah, and then I don't celebrate it when it happens either. So I'm glad that we're turning away from that type of terminology.
Great. Yeah. I don't feel like I have anything that's super necessary to add on that front. So, okay, if we kind of move into can you tell us a little bit about why you're pro-choice? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, by all means.
I think a lot of this we'll probably discuss next time because it does include a lot of autonomy issues and things of that sort.
Mhm.
So I'll just say it quickly, and because I think we'll get more into it this time. But um, I'm typically not a utilitarian. I don't really like utilitarianism, but I could see its use sometimes, and I think this is one of them. I think we have. I mean, if the goal is to stop abortions, which I don't necessarily think is a bad goal.
Is it worth saying something about what utilitarianism is really quick?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, utilitarianism is like the moral theory that the right thing to do is dependent on positive consequences, and the wrong thing to do is um, negative consequences, right? It's a consequentialist moral theory that determines the rightness or wrongness of an action based on the consequences of the action. That's a really, really, really quick way to say it. Um, but I think if the goal is to get rid of abortion, I think it's it's not enough to be like ideologically stubborn. You have to look at what the data says and what works, right? Um, and the data is very clear that countries that have restrictive abortion laws don't have that many less abortions than countries with permissive abortion laws. Uh, I mean, they have some less, but it's not significantly less. After Dobbs, abortions did go down for a while, but now they're back up. And they're about the same as it was before Dobbs. So we have plenty of data that shows that prohibiting abortions doesn't work, or at least it doesn't work as well as other things that do work, that have been shown to work, that the data pans out as working. And that is, you know, contraceptive, you have to have contraceptive education and medically accurate sex education and easy access to contraception. There's been a bunch of data that abortions are reduced when you have uh, medically accurate education and contraception. There's a lot of data that supports that having very strong social safety nets will bring down the abortion. So like Norway and Finland, my husband's from Finland, they have pretty low abortion. They don't have, it's not zero, but it's lower than ours. And they have a really, really strong social welfare system. And that makes sense, right? If the reason that you're getting an abortion is because you are, financially terrified, and in America you should be, because single mothers are one of the most impoverished groups in the country. If your concern is I need to get an abortion because I'm financially terrified, then of course it would make sense that in countries where you don't have that financial terror, you're less likely to opt that way. And we have the data that shows that, right? So that's one of the reasons that I don't think banning abortions is feasible. It doesn't really work. And here are things that do work, and we're not doing those things, right? And I think also, and we could talk about a lot of the stuff that's come up before Dobbs. I don't know how much people have been following these things, but there have been some really scary, messed up things that have happened since Roe was overturned. Women that have almost died in hospitals, hemorrhaged to death because people are so scared of giving them an abortion. And that's happened quite a bit. There's been actually some women also that had to be borderline septic before they got an abortion and almost died. So I think there's a lot of scary things that have been going on after Dobbs, and I don't know to what extent people are aware of it. And then the other reason I'm abortion, and we could talk about this more next time, is just that I think that I think it's analogous to other situations where someone is in need of someone else's body for sustenance, right? So I two or three times a semester there's a blood mobile out here in the university, and they're enticing students to come in, and we'll give you cookies, and we'll give you this, we'll give you that. And there's a really, really big need for blood, and people are dying without it, or platelets. I get a lot of platelet things too. um and yeah, I mean, there is a very dire need for blood and platelets, and people die from not having those things. But in order to save those people, I can't be okay with a society that would force people to give blood, or force people to give platelets, or force people to give an organ. I mean, we don't even force organ donation after the person has died. They have to opt into it, right? Or the family will have to opt into it. But if you're very clear that I don't want my organs donated, they're not going to donate them, even if people would die without it. So, and we have this typical rule that I actually only see violated when it comes to abortion, that people have a right to decide whether or not they want to use their body and their health to save another person's life. And if people have it in other areas, they should have it in this area as well. Um, but that's really, really quick. And I'm sure it's something that we'll get into next time.
Yeah, so I think I'm trying to figure out the best way to handle this, because I think most of the issues you just raised are kind of pretty germane to the kind of autonomy and kind of social political things that we might talk
Yeah.
about next time. But we can open that door. I'm not, we can do that. Maybe what might be good for now is maybe if I take if I take on the question about, why be pro-life, right? And kind of do that from a little bit of a personhood perspective, we
Yeah.
can see if there are some of those issues there. Then maybe next time I'll come back to some of the things. I'm sure Bertha and I see things pretty differently regarding some of the things she was just talking about. But we can either get back around to that next time, or some of that will come up organically this time. Okay, so then if I talk a little bit about kind of why be pro-life, why be against, legal abortion or something like that. I guess I'd say, and now I'm going to focus on questions about like personhood and things like that. So I'd say I'm pro-life because I think that abortion is an act against a vulnerable party, namely the unborn child. And we often hear that called a conceptus, an embryo, fetus, right, at various stages along its developmental trajectory. I'm just going to use fetus as shorthand for any of those stages, basically. I might say too that as to whether I'm fully pro-life, I can only say that that's just something I sort of try to be, right? Because it's hard to really do that, right? In my view, I think that to be fully pro-life, you should be against the death penalty. I am against the death penalty, and I mean we might bring on other types of things. I actually agree with Bertha to a large extent about there being a strong social safety net, right? And those kinds of things. I can guess that maybe not everybody here, or certainly not everybody I bump into, agrees with me about all those kinds of things. But again, right? I think that there's a lot that is involved in being genuinely pro-life. And I'm sure that I'm a sinner, so I'm pretty sure I fail on a lot of those things basically all the time. But I can say that I try, right? Try to be genuinely pro-life. And we can talk a little bit about what that might involve. But one of the things, the thing I want to focus on just for the next couple of minutes is this idea that in order to be pro-life, one of the things you need to do is make it out that the fetus was worthy of protection, right? That the fetus was a bearer of certain kinds of moral rights, okay? That it was a vulnerable party against which action should not be taken, okay? And so, right, there I want to distinguish a couple of different views. One, I'm going to follow a philosopher named Chris Kaiser here, who says that, there's a sort of endowment view and a performance view, right? Endowment views tend to be about, the kinds of things with which you're endowed because of what you are, right? Like if you're a zebra, then you have whatever protections that zebras should be afforded, right? Whereas if you take a performance view, right, maybe you think that certain things that someone can do, right, certain things that someone can perform qualify that person for moral consideration. Okay, I think that endowment views are on the right track. I think performance views are problematic, right? I think a lot of times, I mean, one of the things that I would say here is that ultimately, I think performance views do roughly, and again, you can disagree with me. I'm sure many of you will. That's fine, right? But I think performance views basically do the kind of thing that we don't want any kind of discriminatory legislation to do, right? They sort of allow a particular party to be kind of targeted based on, something that I think is irrelevant about that, right? That person in this case, right? We would think race was irrelevant. We would think that age was irrelevant. We would think that ability status was irrelevant. Those kinds of things, right? I think we should also think that condition of dependency is irrelevant to the kind of thing, right? The kind of moral treatment you can expect. Right. And I think that the fetus is in a particularly dependent state. Right. And so I think that, that's a kind of thing that we should be attentive to. Right. I also think that that's interesting because we don't think that temporarily comatose patients, right, sort of jump out of the category of moral consideration just because they're temporarily comatose, right? But we seem, some of us, right, in societies tend to think that fetuses don't deserve the kind of moral treatment that temporarily comatose patients deserve, right? And I don't think that the resumption of consciousness, the resumption of desires or whatever, right? The resumption of consciousness in the case of a temporarily comatose patient is relevantly different from the initiation of consciousness, right? In the case of the fetus, right? Let's say that the fetus doesn't have, consciousness until the onset of organized cortical brain activity, for example, right? That's a pretty common thing to hear people say. Okay, fair enough. So there's a certain point along the developmental trajectory of the fetus where it doesn't plausibly have consciousness. Sure, that's something pretty well everybody's going to grant, right? But is it relevant that it doesn't have consciousness? The temporarily comatose patient doesn't have consciousness, and the temporarily comatose patient, we think, will resume consciousness. Why is that? Why is it that the temporarily comatose patient resumes consciousness? I think that the reason the temporarily comatose patient resumes consciousness is because what we take to be important there is grounded in the organism that the temporarily comatose patient has not stopped being. Okay. But I don't think the fetus I think the fetus is already an organism, right? I think the fetus attains a kind of organismal integrity pretty early along the developmental trajectory, right? And from that sort of point, the fetus is an organism. Temporarily comatose patient is also an organism. Temporarily comatose patient doesn't have consciousness, hasn't resumed consciousness, but the fetus hasn't initiated consciousness yet. Is that a relevant distinction? I think not. That's part of it. Okay. And yeah. So we can talk more about some of those things. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's probably okay for stopping right now. I mean, there's plenty more to say, of course, but I don't want to just subject this crowd to more of my thoughts there. Let's see, Bertha, let's see.
Can
Yeah.
I talk about personhood too?
Yeah, absolutely. I think now's the time we just want to respond to each other, right? So
Yeah. So I hold a view that's probably surprising about these issues for someone that's pro-choice, which has gotten me in quite a bit of trouble with pro-choice people. Yeah. Here are my intuitions. So okay, let me start with, I've been reading stuff about personhood easily for 25 years. Easily. I have yet to be satisfied with any particular answer. I think there's one answer that's best, and we'll talk about it now, but problematic. I think personhood is a very, very complicated issue. I don't think, um, you know, I don't think pro-choice people take it as seriously as they should. Again, another time I cringe is when pro-choice people say, yeah, the moment personhood begins when you're born. And like, yeah, no, like, because that would entail that you would have to be okay with like getting an abortion the day before birth, right? And then the response is, oh yeah, but that, people don't do that. I'm like, right, but okay, right. People don't typically go in the day before they're due to be induced and demand an abortion, right? I don't know if that's ever happened for no reason. Right, but that's not the point. The point is that theoretically, you would need to be in favor of that if you think that birth is where personhood begins. And I find that repulsive. I find the idea of being able to abort a 9-month-old fetus that's, perfectly healthy, with absolutely no issues for social, I find that repulsive. And we could talk about that because there's a question there about how can I be in favor of late-term abortions. So that whole, personhood begins at birth, I think it's bad. It's a bad argument and has really concerning implications. But similarly, I think that the whole like personhood begins at fertilization is equally problematic. Um, and here's why. And both of these issues is because I think the logical consequences of these things are problematic, and so I think that the position is problematic. When it comes to the pro-life side, where personhood begins at fertilization, it is the case that thousands of embryos, fertilized eggs are discarded every year at fertility clinics. If you've undergone fertility issues and you create all these embryos and you use them, you have your baby and you're like, I'm done, I don't want to have any more, and there's like 3 or 4 embryos left, you can't adopt them out. That's possible. But a lot of people will give them over to research, or they'll just defrost them and discard them as a biohazard, right? um I don't what is that like? And this is like thousands a year, right? Is that equivalent to like a genocide, right? You would have to say that if you think that personhood begins at the moment of fertilization and that a fertilized egg has just as much moral status as a fully, grown human being, you would be on the hook to saying that throwing away thousands of embryos every year is morally equivalent to a genocide. Um, and I just think that's ridiculous. Now, do I have an argument for that? No, that's why I said I'm beginning with it. These are my intuitions, right? Then this is the same thing. My intuition for the other one is I think it's repugnant to say personhood begins at birth. I think because it has really, problematic implications. And similarly, I think it's not reasonable to say it begins at fertilization either, because it has very unreasonable implications. Um, I also hate, and Jack knows this, despise this whole like, oh, well, it's just a clump of cells, or oh, it's just a product of conception. And oh, I hate that. I hate it. Or the one I really hate is like, oh, well, they're not human. And I'm like, I have no idea what that, like, students will say to that to me, well, they're not human. I'm like, I don't understand what you mean by that, right? It's clearly a human. Like, I didn't give birth to like a dog. I gave birth to a human baby, right? So it's clearly human. So I don't understand what people mean when they say those things. I think they mean it's not a person, but that's a whole other issue. But I hate that whole clumps of cells stuff. For the main reason I hate it is because it's disparaging. And disparaging and biologically inaccurate, right? It is probably true that an embryo is a cluster of cells very early on when it's a zygote or things like that. Um, but by the time it's implanted and you start secreting hormones enough to know that you're pregnant, and by the time you are, able to have an abortion, which is like about, 4 or 6 weeks, that's when you could actually see the embryo on an ultrasound screen. It is far more than a clump of cells. Right? I agree that heartbeats begin early. I agree that fingers or toes begin early. I so it's biologically inaccurate and it's disparaging. Because even if it is, when people say it's a clump of cells, they mean it as, oh, it's just something, to throw away. And I don't feel that way at all about it. So I hate that terminology. I also hate that terminology because it's misused by a lot by the pro-life people, because there'll be I'll watch this on Facebook. There'll be a video of like a really premature birth, like a 21-week-old baby that was born, and they're very little, very premature. We'll see it, and then people will say, and I can't believe people say that's a clump of cells. Like, no, nobody says that. Like, no one's gonna say that a 20-week-old fetus is a clump of cells. So it's misused on one side and it's disparaging on the other. I hate that terminology. I never use it.
Mhm.
In terms of personhood, and this is where Jack and I will have a disagreement, I actually do think that the onset of consciousness is relevant. And I think the onset of consciousness is relevant for reasons having to do with identity. I think that, so the question is, when did you begin? When did the person begin, right? Um, I think because I have certain metaphysical beliefs about identity, that personhood is related to the mind, right? That you exist so long as you are conscious and so long as you have a mind. This is one reason I think that if you are in a permanent coma, and I ask this to my students all the time, right? If someone, entered a coma, um, you know, a permanent coma, and their body didn't die for 10 or 15 years after that, when did the person die? Did the person die at the onset of the permanent coma, or when their body finally died? And almost all my students, almost all of them will say when they went into the coma. And so I think that shows that most people are sympathetic to the idea that you exist so long as your mind exists in some way, as long as your consciousness exists in some way. And if that's true for the end of life, it ought to be equally true for the beginning of life, right? And the reason I think that's different, so like when Jack says, well, how about the temporary comatose patient? You wouldn't kill them. And I would say, yes, that's right. You wouldn't kill them because when they come out of that coma, it's a continuation of their identity. They're the same person. Whereas the onset of consciousness means that person hasn't started yet. And so I think there's a difference between saying there's a continuation of personhood and that's why we don't kill them versus it hasn't started yet. So, and so I for that reason, I don't think it's the same thing. But we can have that discussion more.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot to think through here. So I mean, I think maybe I'll try to give a couple more responses to some of the things you've said. And then you can certainly rejoin if you like and that kind of thing. And then maybe, I mean, we're 10 to 2 now. Maybe we can open it up for questions after that. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. All right. So just a couple of things that I was noticing. And I think that, I mean, we've been doing this a long time. We know that neither one of us is going to win, right? This is pretty normal, right? This is complicated stuff. It's fine. But but I think that so Bertha's claim then that if we talked about frozen embryos, right? Discarded embryos, and if we did that and we were talking about those, and I mean, at some point, I don't know. I think when we were writing this book, it was like 600,000 a year or something like that, right?
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a
Yeah,
lot.
I mean, it's probably, I don't know what the numbers have done since that time, but it's like government agencies were reporting figures like that. This wasn't some like right-wing conspiracy theorist or
Mhm.
whatever. It was just the government was reporting this kind of data, right? And I actually think that that is just really, really distressing, right? I think that that is I mean in terms of the genocide, I don't think genocide would probably be a misnomer, I think, because I mean the root of the term, I think, is really more about nations, that kind of thing. I mean, it's not targeting a nation group or a cultural group or an ethnic group or anything like that. But I do think it is targeting a group of people, right, with a vulnerable condition of dependency. And year by year, right, these people die, right? And it's very distressing. And I think it says a lot about the culture that we live in, right? And I mean, there's a certain way in which I want to say, I, it's just another way in which this issue is so vexed and so fraught that it's sort of hard to believe people ever do keep it together about this, right? It's I mean, is it? Do I think it's a tragedy? Yes, I think it's a tragedy, right? Do I think that the thing to do is to sort of like, I don't think that the solution, however, is to compel women to gestate, right? That's just like one more wrong on top of another wrong, right? You don't right wrongs by another wrong. That's not going to work. Right. So what could possibly be the solution? I mean, pro-life people talk about what would happen if someday we develop the technology to basically have artificial wombs. What are the questions we need to figure out then? Right. I don't know. Those are some interesting questions, but we're not there. We're not there. right? So like 600,000 discarded embryos, right? Let's say in some given year, which is not, not crazy, right? Is that a big deal? Yeah, it's a big deal. What's the solution? Well, what I'd love to see a solution is people don't create those kinds of embryos, right? At least not in the measure and number, right, that they generally do, with the idea that what I'm going to do on the other end of that is just sort of selectively discard, right, the ones I don't want. I'm pro-life. What do you want? Right? Do I think that? Yes, I do. Right? Am I like angry with people over it? I mean, it's not that simple. Right? I think we disagree, but does that mean that I think people are evil because they do these kinds of things? No, it's complicated.
I want to say that I want to praise Jack
Yeah.
for at least for his consistency. Because this has been in the news a lot, that people, a lot of politicians that are pushing, that were in favor of overturning Roe are like, but we really, we're really pro IVF. I mean, we're not touching that. Not only are we not touching that, we're going to give you money to make sure that you can do IVF, right? So, and that's because that's what the public likes, right?
Right.
And that's inconsistent. You cannot have it both ways, right? You cannot think that life begins at fertilization and also think that IVF, in the way that we do it now, that does result in these excess embryos, is
Right.
also ethical. And so I at the very least, and this is something I've always appreciated about Catholicism, if anything, they're consistent. Because the contradiction annoys the hell out of me. So I want to praise that.
Yeah. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I know. I mean, whatever. I do think that in popular politics, you get all kinds of contradictions a lot of the time, and it's really no respecter of right or left most of the time.
Oh yeah.
People just say what they want without considering the wider implications, theoretically, especially. But yeah, I mean, one last thing before we kind of transition to some questions, I think, if that's okay. I'd just say that, I think consciousness is just really, really one of the deep mysteries of of our existence, right? Philosophers of mind have not reached any kind of anything close to like, this is how consciousness happens. They just haven't, right? And there's no reason to expect that the answer is in the offing anytime soon, right? Some philosophers of mind, for example, argue that consciousness is purely a material phenomenon. Fine, whatever. We don't really know exactly how consciousness begins, what exactly it is, right? We like to link it to personhood, but I think a lot of times that gets us into some real quagmires. God bless you, Bertha. I think there are sometimes you wander into some of them, right? But right, you think the same thing by me, and that's fine, right? So like, how do we know that the person is the same, right? When the person resumes consciousness, because we're talking about the same organism, right? The person, has different, tendencies, different characteristics, different personality traits after certain kinds of medical treatment. What do we say? Is it a totally different person? Well, a person's changed, but do we say this is like a totally different person? No, generally not. We don't. Right. And I also think that developing laws on the basis of something as forgive the word here, but is on the basis of something as spooky as consciousness that is poorly understood at best, right, is a weird place to start for laws, right? On the other hand, I think it, is a fairly ordinary place to start for laws when we talk about, let's see how many people we got in this room. I don't know. Anybody got an idea? 30-ish? What is it? 40? All right, let's say it's 40. I mean, what would we count as a person inside this room? Probably the 40-ish people we got, talking to one another, bumping into each other, right? tapping each other on the shoulder saying, hey, we should go grab coffee or something like that, right? Probably those people, right? Those are probably the people we would call persons, right? How do we know that they're persons? Well, we bump into them, we talk to them, right? They're organisms, you know. They meet whatever we regard as the conditions for human personhood. If a turtle walked into here, we probably wouldn't call it a person. We'd probably freak out a little bit and try to figure out how we're going to remove a turtle from the room. But you know, we'd still be like, well, it's probably not a person. But how would we know if there were? I mean, if there were an extra 20 people in this room by way of consciousnesses, how would we know? How would we know that it weren't true? I don't know. I got nothing. Right. But I think the law is probably going to be a safer bet, right? If we stick with the people we just sort of bump into and recognize as having the organismal integrity we usually attribute to persons. Anyway, sorry. I don't know how much that, I mean, feel free to respond.
Well, just to, really quick, because this is, I think it's important for the audience. So you would disagree with the majority of my students when they say that if a person entered a coma, permanent coma, but their body didn't die till like 15 years later, most of my students say the body died, but the person died at the onset of the coma. You would disagree with that?
That's right. That's right.
Okay. Yeah.
And Bertha, here's a case that I always find helpful, right? When Bertha and I are talking, right? Like, I think that I was an embryo. And I think if I recall our conversations in the past correctly, Bertha, you might say, and obviously I'm going to give you the floor here, but like in the past, I think you've said that it's not true that you were an embryo. Is that true or no?
I mean, you in the sense of personal identity?
Yes. Yes.
No, then no, I don't think I was an embryo.
Right.
I think that's the
I was an
beginning.
embryo.
I think that's the beginning of my body.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
was the beginning of my organism. But in terms of the beginning of me,
Mhm.
no, I don't think it was that. Because I do think that a person who enters a coma and then the body dies 15 years later, I agree with my students that the person died at the onset of the coma. And
Right.
so by the same logic, I think the person begins at the onset of consciousness.
Right. And
I think I'm a mind. I think essentially what makes me is my mind and my consciousness.
yeah, and I think that's a nice place where typically at least you and I tend to disagree. I don't think I'm an embryo. I think I was an embryo, right? And I also think that this is a place where Bertha is being admirably consistent, right? I think that's right. You know, that would be the way to maintain a consistent pro-choice position, or at least one kind of. There are lots of different kinds of pro-choice positions, and I just think that would be a consistent way for Bertha to maintain her pro-choice position. How are we doing? Are we okay?
Yeah, it's good.
Cool. Yeah, I don't know. Like we could take some time. I think are we here until like 2:30, right? That's awesome. Okay. Great. And now I think the plan for next time is that there's a whole nest of other issues that we really didn't talk much about today that have to do with autonomy and kind of the political environment in which you know, the political kinds of realities that we think abortion raises. And so we can talk about that next time. Definitely will be different kinds of issues we'll be talking about next time. But yeah, so we started talking about some personhood stuff, and we're all ears if you want to talk some questions. Okay. Do you want to handle the questions, Mark, or whoever's? Oh, great. Yeah.
So I don't know much about philosophy, so I'm interested in the philosophical underpinnings to solving a question like a pregnant woman has a medical condition that will make it dangerous for her to continue a pregnancy. So what is the philosophical underpinning that would support allowing that abortion if your view is that personhood begins at conception. Or another example would be, what are the philosophical underpinnings that might allow the use of an aborted fetus to be used for medical research that could save the life of people who had definitely attained consciousness, right? People who are walking among us who have a disease that would impact their life or be terminal. So I'd like to understand those philosophical underpinnings that might support, sort of, both views, a pro-life person feeling comfortable with an abortion occurring because of those types of situations.
I think that one might be calling my name, Bertha, if that's okay
Yeah.
for a start. Yeah, so great. Thanks for your question. Yeah, I mean, there's some interesting things that we can say in response to this. So for example, I'll give you two cases, and I think one of them is pretty close to the case I'm hearing from you, but let me know. Two cases that are paradigm cases, at least, I mean, I'm Catholic, so these are paradigm cases where, like, the Catholic Church, which is a kind of avowedly pro-life organization in this way, right, would say, yeah, that's a responsible medical intervention, right? It wouldn't call it an abortion, but that would be, I'll give you the cases, and you can judge how similar they are to yours. Okay, the first one would be like a cancerous uterus, for example, right? So like if you've got, if someone has like a cancerous uterus, right, and the cancer has evolved to the point where the woman's life is in jeopardy, right? And look, I mean, you're gonna have, I mean, the woman's carrying the fetus, right? And if the woman's gonna die, the fetus is gonna die if the woman dies, right? What's a responsible medical intervention? Well, a responsible medical intervention would be to treat the cancer, right? And if treating the cancer, right, in the case where every measure has been taken to ensure that, the fetus's life can be saved if at all possible, but every measure has been taken to try to make it so that both people can survive, right? But if the woman's life is in danger, and if she dies, the fetus dies, and all of that, right? You treat the cancer, you treat the patient, right? You treat the woman. And if, unfortunately, right, the medical treatment that is necessary in order to heal the woman, right, suffering from the cancer, unfortunately, in a way that's foreseen but not directly intended, right, involves the death of the fetus, then that's still permissible, right? That's an instance of a philosophical principle that we call double effect, right? Double effect says that sometimes good actions can have bad consequences, right? And those bad consequences can be accepted as long as they're not directly intended, right? Even if they are also foreseen but not directly intended, right? And if the good that is healing the mother, right, is an important proportionate good relative to the situation we're faced with, right? So can you treat a patient even when the necessary medical treatment of that patient involves the death of a fetus? Yes, you can, right? And I'd be happy to show you cases where, like, pro-life people say just that. Another case, which is quite a bit earlier in most kinds of kind of reflections on abortion and things like that, it involves the ectopic pregnancy, right? Where usually like a clearly permissible case among this group of pro-life theorists would be something called a salpingectomy, right? Where a salpingectomy would be, the embryo is lodged in the fallopian tube, hasn't yet reached the uterus. If some kind of action isn't taken, the tube could rupture, the woman could die, naturally the fetus would also, the embryo would also die, right? One intervention that is pretty much, I mean, I don't know anybody in the pro-life community that would reject this, is what's called a salpingectomy, which is just a removal or, a removal of the portion of the tube, right, in which the embryo is lodged. Does that result in the death of the fetus or the embryo? Yes, it does. Is that okay? Yeah, it is. Is it regrettable? Of course. Right. But you need to treat the patient, right? I'm sorry, I've been talking for a long time, but okay, sorry. I don't know who's next, but yeah.
So this is a question mostly for Bertha probably, but if personhood begins at consciousness, how do we define when consciousness begins? I'm a violinist, and when I was pregnant with my first child, I could definitely tell that he was moving around in response to music. So I know at some point they start to hear in the womb.
Yeah, and there's actually been a lot of, I mean, clearly there's, a baby will recognize their parent's voice and stuff. That's a good question, and I think it's true with Jack that, consciousness is mysterious in terms of, how can a purely organic mass give rise to consciousness? And in order to answer your question to the best of our ability currently, I just think you have to look at neurology, and what we know about, at least what we know now about neurology, and that's that in order for a being to experience any level of consciousness, there are some things that your body needs to have. You need to have a cerebral cortex. You need to have cortical activity. You need to have certain neurons in your brain attached to that cortical activity. And we know, I mean, as much as we can know anything about neurology, right? That those parts of the brain are the ones that are mostly responsible for consciousness, right? So when someone enters a permanent coma, or someone enters like a persistent vegetative state, and they've done like scans of their brains, the cortex is destroyed. I think there's a case that I talked to my students about of Terry Schiavo, who was an issue in the early 2000s, and I showed them the image of her brain compared to the image of a regular brain, and like all of her cerebral cortex is gone. It's liquefied. There's just black there, right? So as much as we know, these parts of the brain working a certain way are requisite for consciousness. And another thing that we don't know exactly when that starts, but we do know that a fetus younger than 20 weeks does not have those requisite brain connections. Their cerebral cortex isn't developed. Their neurons necessary to connect their spinal cord to the cerebral cortex is not developed. And so, but I'm actually quite fine with being conservative about this. I think saying that consciousness begins about 20 weeks is conservative. I think probably a little later it begins, but I don't think we know enough. But I do think that we do know that the requisite parts of the brain that are necessary for consciousness is in place by 20 weeks. And so I'm willing to say that that consciousness can potentially begin by 20 weeks, but we do know enough to know it probably doesn't begin prior to that, because the requisite brain activity doesn't exist yet.
Barb talked about her son listening to music, and I would be of the opinion, as the father of that child, that my son was still my son a month before that or 2 months before that. He was still my son and still a person, even if he couldn't hear or didn't have consciousness.
Yeah, and that will, which is fine, and I think Jack would agree, right? And this is the one thing that I think that philosophy is so important to study, and that people don't study it enough, is that these are assumptions about personal identity, right? Obviously, you don't think that you are identical with your mind, or that you begin to exist when your mind did. Right? You think your son existed before his mind came into being, and that's fine. That's a theory of identity. That's called animalism, and or the biological account, which I think that's what Jack defends in his book. And that theory of identity has been defended, but you have that belief because you have a certain theory of personal identity. And I do think that stuff needs to be talked more about. I don't share that view of identity, and so that's why I wouldn't say that. So it does come down to this, metaphysical view of what makes you you.
That's a great response, Bertha. Thank you.
Again, thank you very much for this discussion there. I think we've all found it informative. I think one of the interesting questions at this point, after Dodd, was, do people see abortion differently? Do the statistics change? Now that there's been a shift to medical abortions, that you can get pills to take it home, you don't have to go to a clinic or a hospital. Has it changed the discussion and the philosophy that's being approached from a practical point of view now that that's so much more widespread?
I don't feel like it has much. I think people who were pro-life before are still pro-life now in terms of medical abortions. And people who were pro-choice before are still pro-choice now in terms of medical abortions. So I haven't seen much of a philosophical change because of medical abortions. I've seen people who were pro-life before still be pro-life in terms of this. I don't know if Jack has seen different.
I don't think so. I think you meant Dobbs versus Jackson, right? That's the case you were referring to.
The Dobbs case, the overturning of Roe.
Right. Yeah. I'm sorry. I didn't hear the last thing you said.
Yeah. Again, I think the question really is, now that legalized and the use, FDA approval of medical abortions has become widely accepted, has that changed the demographic? Has it changed the type of people? Has it changed, a move toward much earlier abortions? I think these are all appropriate questions when we begin to talk about societal approach to abortion at this point.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I mean, I don't think I have a lot to add to what Bertha said, other than just that.
I haven't seen a significant change. Me personally, I haven't seen a significant change.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen a significant change either, though I do think that when cultural shifts happen, most people tend to fall in line. Most people don't care that much about consistency. I think they should care more about it, but I don't think they do.
I have one comment about the end of life and another comment about the beginning of life. Comment about the end of life is today, most of us probably at our ages have been approached at least once by doctors about forming an advance directive, so that we are the ones to decide to tell our children or heirs when to pull the plug. And that's a document. My husband was a chaplain in a big hospital. And so part of the chaplain's job is to make people aware of that document and what it does. And that if you say, well, I'll leave the choice to the doctor. No, you won't. It's against the law. The doctor doesn't make that choice.
You're talking about a durable power of attorney or something like that, or?
No, not a durable power of attorney.
Okay, yeah.
I'm talking about an advance
Oh, right, yeah, yeah.
directive
Yeah, sure. Okay.
that kicks in when the person is not able to make that decision themselves, like they're
Yeah,
being
yeah.
intubated or
Right.
they're in a coma. It's very easy to say a temporary coma or a permanent coma, but nobody knows where that line is between temporary and permanent. So it would be the person making that decision for your heirs and saving your family a lot of stress and worry and guilt and torture, and the hospital perhaps prolonging a life that no one wanted to prolong. And then that's a waste of medical resources that could go to someone else. On the other hand, older people should never be encouraged, well, don't you know that once you're unconscious, you know, you have an obligation to sort of sign off because somebody else was waiting
Right.
for your bed. You can't do that to people either. That's another pressure that we need to be afraid of as a.
Agreed.
Now about abortion. I think probably everybody in this room knows the world of how it is when abortion is illegal, because when we were in high school and college, abortion was just pretty much illegal. And I wonder how many people in this room knew someone who got an abortion in the time when they were in high school and college, a roommate, a sister, a child, a person you knew about, got an abortion. And we can do that because we're all white and we can all scrape together $100 and we know how to get to another state. And so people who are privileged can have access to abortion, but people who are not privileged don't have that access. And if we decide to keep our child and give it up for adoption, our white children will be snapped right up. In fact, the adoption agency have a choice of families waiting for a child. But if your child is Black, it's not that way. They'll be in the foster system, especially if they get a little bit older before they get adopted. So all of these are part of the moral world that we lived in, where tough decisions have to be made. Could you ask just a couple questions and some show of hands? How many people knew someone who got an abortion in the old days when it was pretty difficult to get it? And how many approved of the abortion at the time, knew enough about it to have your own opinion and felt that you understood what went into the decision versus just slapping on it was wrong or it was right judgment?
I have a question. It's Don. Bill, sorry, Bill. When you said, okay, I considered my child when we first came pregnant. So what happens then if the woman, they're going to have the child and she's out shopping and she gets mugged, beat up, she survives, but she has a miscarriage? Should that be considered a murder? Yeah, but I mean, I guess pose that to our presenters here. How would you look at that then?
I actually think that Jack has a better answer than me on this. Because I know Jack is going to say yes, and he would be perfectly consistent in saying yes. I would have my answers would be more problematic, because my views of it's my answer will be more problematic. My intuition is to say that if it's an early enough pregnancy, it's not equivalent to murder. But it doesn't mean it's not a significant loss. I don't know if I would say it's murder. I don't think I'd give someone the death penalty for that, for example. But Jack wouldn't either because he's anti-death penalty. But I think that my position has a much harder time answering that question than Jack's position does. And I'll bite that bullet that I don't have a good enough answer for that. My intuition is to say it's not murder, but it's also not inconsequential either. But my argument, I don't have a ready-made argument for that.
Would you at least consider it manslaughter?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know if it's really early, probably not, but I don't know when it would be, and I'm not ready to defend it. I'm sympathetic to I don't know. I think it's a great question that I am not prepared to answer. And it's a hard question, and I think it's problematic for my position.
Well, if I can just jump in really quick, it's kind of Bertha to say that, but just being pro-life doesn't make all the difficulties of that go away, right? Just because like Mark is pointing out, there are lots of different legal shades to that question that would need to be worked out, and I don't say that those are easy to figure out either, right? I don't even want to call abortion murder in general, right? So that means I wouldn't want to use that term for what happened in regard to, well, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's, that case is tricky because someone's being targeted, right? But with regard to what might, what the assailant meant to do with regard to the fetus, then we got to figure out what that action is like. And so, yeah, it's complicated.
I mean, Scott Peterson got 2 murder charges, right? Because he killed his
yeah.
wife and he killed the fetus, but the fetus was really far along. He was about to be born.
Right.
But at the, should someone that rear ends a pregnant woman and causes a miscarriage be on the hook for manslaughter? I don't know. I want to say no. But yeah, I don't.
So I'm going to take this in a little bit different direction. I'm interested in the whole idea of civil discourse around this topic. And my impression is that many people on either side of the issue tend to vilify the people that don't believe like they do.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if each of you could spend a minute or two reflecting on what you think makes the two of you different in terms of your ability to kind of understand and accept each other's differing viewpoints on this, as evidenced by your abilities to be on the same program together and some of those kinds of things.
I think for me, there's a lot of things. I think that's a great question. The primary thing for me is that, I was friends with Jack before we talked about any of this, right? We were office mates and stuff, and I knew his wife was amazing. And so I knew going into it that he's a good person, and that he's a kind person and he's an empathetic person. And so I didn't come into it assuming the worst of him, because I knew all this stuff about him previously. So to me, that's one of the first ones. Another one for me also is that I think being philosophers is really helpful here because we're able to disentangle the issues. I think we have like a metaphysical a difference in metaphysical belief about personal identity. Am I going to hate someone because they don't have the same metaphysical belief than me? No, it's absurd. It's metaphysics is weird. Um, and then third, I said this earlier, I really appreciate his ability to be empathetic. That already makes me go in being equally empathetic, right? That he's not here saying women who get abortions are murderers. And he's not here saying women who get abortions are irresponsible or sexually promiscuous or, and assuming the absolute worst and that there's never a good reason to get an abortion. And it's always, a horrible thing. He doesn't do that. He at least appreciates the complexity and the nuance that goes into getting an abortion. And the fact that he doesn't think the worst about people that do get abortions makes me react to him differently.
Yeah, thanks, Bertha. And I mean, thanks for your good question. I mean, yeah, I mean, like for Bertha, I mean, I was just always impressed with her ability to like really process the question each time, almost as if it were the first time, like what's the, and just really, kind of want to come your way, but know, where, still like in order to process an issue like this, you need to be people that have convictions that you're not just going to toss out, but also want to come, toward the other person as much as you can, right? And that's I think important. They also, I need to echo what Bertha said too about friendship here. I think it's indispensable, really, just because I mean, I just, I mean, it is hard to like have dialogue about this kind of issue when you don't know someone. It's a lot harder. And yeah, I mean, I miss Bertha. I mean, like I mean, I wish that we lived closer. We don't. It's too bad. But I mean, somebody, Gene came to me and said, "Hey, could you do something about abortion?" I was like, "Oh, great. This will give me an excuse to talk to Bertha," right? Yeah, I mean, like, and that sort of gives you kind of this kind of beginning thing where you say, look, I already believe that this person, we're gonna have fun one way or the other, right? So like, I already believe that this person is approaching this in a helpful way. I already believe that this person cares about me, right? So we're not gonna like be at each other's throats, right? That's just bread. We don't have to, of course, right? And that's hard when you haven't established that kind of trust with someone. So that is at a premium for sure.
I'm not sure if my question still really is part of this, but I just had a couple thoughts. Two words that have been, consistency has been a big word here. Certainty, not so much. And I think those words have some tension. And I admire consistency, but I don't really admire certainty a lot of the time, because I think it takes away our humanity, because we are fallible people, humans, and we don't always get it right. And when we start to talk about legislating things, which was what the topic before this, legislation is a very fallible tool.
Mm-hmm.
And we only do justice with a small j. We don't do God's justice in our legislation. We get it as close as we can in maybe little increments. So I just feel like we need to honor each other's fallibility.
Makes sense.
Okay, we'll close with that and we'll meet next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. So I actually have a meeting in 2 minutes, so I gotta go.
Thanks for your time, Bertha. Appreciate it.
All right, bye. Thank you. I'll see you next week.
Bye. See ya.
Bye.